I have a disclaimer before I speak, which is that almost nothing that I'm about to say is from the Bible. So you can feel free to completely ignore it, except maybe for the moment when I quote Psalm 23, but we won't worry about that. Everything Jen said, almost everything Jen said, I mean in the best possible way, almost everything Jen said was from the Bible. So I'm glad you had your best fresh ears for her. For me, as I say, take it or leave it as you wish. But I've been asked to give a talk about how to give a talk that really kind of sticks in people's minds. So if I, in fact, give a really boring, bad talk that you don't remember anything of, it's actually quite embarrassing. So we just won't talk about it afterwards, all right? That can be the deal between you and me. But I want to tell you a story to begin with of a time a few years ago when the Lord did something which at the time felt quite unkind to me. So I had recently had my third child, and I'd recently published my first book. And I was going to speak at a conference in England where I'm from. I was quite nervous about this conference because in America, people think I'm intelligent because I sound English. In England, I don't have that kind of accent boost. And what's worse, I was actually going to a part of England, in the north of England, where my accent makes me sound like a kind of posh idiot. So I'm walking into this space, and I know that I'm going to give talks on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday at this conference. And my first talk's on science and faith. My best friend in England, who's not a Christian, had very kindly come with me to the conference. And that first morning, we had breakfast together in a little hotel. And then I said, I'm just going to go up to our room to practice my talk. And I went upstairs, and there I am, and I'm thinking, I'm going to not look at my notes for a bit. I'm just going to sort of see if I can get my introduction kind of flowing in my head prior to giving this talk. And as I'm starting, pacing around my little hotel room, starting to think about my talk, there's a phone call on the hotel room phone, and I pick it up, and it's the conference organizer saying, "Where are you?" And I realized in that moment that whereas I thought I was speaking at 10:30 a.m., they thought I was speaking at 9:30 a.m., and I'm at a hotel that's like a good half mile away from the conference center. I have not yet been to the conference center. I didn't even know where it is, okay? So I have to run out of that room. I text my friend just saying, "It's now." That was all I had time for. I literally run out of the room. I didn't have time to find my notes. I'm running down the street. I'm asking people, where is the conference center? This little northern village in England, where's the conference center? And I get there, and 5 minutes, maybe closer to 10, but somewhat embarrassingly late, I'm jumping up onto the stage, and I have to go a 45-minute talk on science and faith. Did I mention the part about without my notes? It's horrifying. What I discovered was that I forgot all the parts of my talk that were quite forgettable. And I remembered, my opening illustration, I remembered the 4 main points I was going to make, I remembered the conclusion, and somehow, by the Lord's grace and mercy, I got through those 45 minutes. And I texted my best friend who is a Christian in America, and I said, this terrible thing just happened to me. I was thrown up onto the stage by the Lord to give a talk without my notes. And she said, I randomly woke up in the middle of the night, at the time in England when you were giving that talk, with the strong sense that I needed to pray for you. It was pray for Rebecca. She prayed for me, and she went back to sleep. And I thought, oh, okay, Lord, I'm getting a little message here that maybe this is something that I need to get more comfortable doing. The reason I tell you that story is, number one, because I want you to know that in the hard times as well as in the happy times, anytime you're trying to minister God's word, the Lord is with you, even if it feels kind of unkind at the moment, even if he's with you in the ways that you almost wish he wasn't with you. And also to encourage you towards the first point that I'm going to make in this little talk here, which is to take risks. Now I'm going to break all the rules of Christian speaking by telling you I have 5 points, not 3, not 4, but 5. Are you ready? And the first one is take risks. Second is plant flags. Third is make metaphors. Fourth is tell stories. And fifth is create contrasts. But they're all going to be very quick because I'm told I need to finish in about 15 minutes. I usually have a countdown clock so I can be sure I'm entering at the right time. And today I just have a clock, so I have to be intelligent enough to figure out what the time is. So if I'm still talking and people are falling off their chairs and dying on the ground, like when Paul was preaching for overly long, then just, somebody drag me off the stage. It'll be better for all of us. So number one, take risks. When I stand in front of an audience, and when you stand in front of an audience, anytime you have the opportunity to do that, it can be tempting to think that unless we are really boring, everybody's probably listening to us. It's a little bit like, I don't know if you can imagine a kind of spotty, nerdy 13-year-old boy who's desperately in love with a beautiful girl in his class. Like everything she does fascinates him, the way she flicks her hair, the way she reads her book, the way she chats with her friends. When we're speaking to an audience, we tend to think that they're kind of absolutely tuned into what we're doing. In actual fact, we are like that spotty, nerdy 13-year-old boy who is desperately trying to get the audience's attention. Otherwise, they are in fact not listening to us at all. They are thinking about their dog or their boyfriend or their lunch or whatever it is. They are not thinking about us. It's a bit like, you know, in films when somebody is slowly bleeding out and their friend is with them going, stay with me, stay with me, stay with me, like this. If you don't do that one way or another to your audience, they are not staying with you. And I'm going to prove it to you now. My guess is in this room, we have a room full of quite attentive sermon listeners, right? I'm guessing as well, we have a room full of people who go to churches where the preaching is actually pretty good. I guarantee that on Sunday morning, at some point, you were thinking about your lunch or your boyfriend or your grandchild or whatever it is, and not, in fact, what the pastor was saying. Am I right? Your mind was wandering off someplace. And if you are not fighting for your audience's attention at all times, that is exactly what is happening. And however brilliant and word-soaked and wonderful what you're saying is, if they're not listening to you, you might as well be reading the telephone book. So we've got to take risks to make our audience actually listen to us. Now, why does taking risks help with that? I don't know about you, but I love the Winter Olympics. I find it so much more fun than the Summer Olympics, because in the summer, the question is, who is going to run the fastest? In the winter, the question is, who's going to crash off the course completely, or try one of those like spins that they do on the ice skating and like fall smack on their butts, yeah? We're watching because there is risk that something bad is going to happen. And as you watch me now, you're thinking, oh dear, something bad might happen. She might completely forget what our next point is, yeah? So you're sort of watching with that slightly kind of maybe you would enjoy if I fell flat on my butt sort of feeling, but you're watching because I am taking a risk with you. I am also worried that I'm not going to remember what my second point is, so you guys might have to help me with that. Now, speaking without any notes is not the only way to take a risk with an audience. I was reflecting earlier when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King gave his incredible I Have a Dream speech. He had his notes right there. The good Lord knows he was taking huge risks as he stood there in front of that audience and said those things. So I'm not saying this is the only way to take a risk, but it is certainly one way to take a risk and to force ourselves to connect with our audience, because in my experience, almost nobody wants to be lectured to, and almost everybody wants to talk. So in the various ways that we stand up in front of an audience and think, I'm talking to a sort of faceless mass, and I'm going to either kind of lecture them or hide behind something so that I don't have to be confronted with them, we're actually missing the opportunity to connect with the individual people in the room. And it's in that connection that people actually learn. So number one, I would encourage you to take risks as you seek to communicate. Number two is to plant flags. Now again, going back to that Winter Olympics, you know that, I never quite know what it's called, but when they're skiing downhill and they have to do that sort of sideways thing in between those flags, what's that called? Slalom. Oh, that's a cool word, slalom. I'll use that again. The gentlemen and ladies who do the slalom, as it's called, they have to go down the course as quickly as possible, but hitting each of those flags, right? And the flags are kind of slender little things with a bright red, slender little pointy thing with a bright red flag on the top. I have all the technical language at my fingertips, as you can tell. And as I think about preparing a talk, I tend to think in terms of what flags am I going to plant that will chart my course down this little mountain, and that will help not only me, but also you to remember what I said. Now, thinking about those flags, I say they're quite slender. When the ladies and gentlemen bump into them, they sort of swizzle to the side. That's also a very technical term, swizzling in slalom. And in my experience, if somebody's talk points are, number one, Jesus is the sacrificial king who came to save all the world by his death on the cross for us. It's a wonderful thing to say. But if that's point one, nobody's going to remember it, let alone points 2 and point 3. You need something that's actually quite boiled down and sticky for them to remember what it is that you said. So I would work really hard on what your flags are. And here's the beauty of planting those flags. So I said, not only did they help you to remember what I said, they also help me to remember what I'm going to say. So when I was flung up onto that stage in the north of England, I at least knew what my 4 main points were. And so I could organize my material around them. And when I came to moments, and this has happened to me multiple times in all the times that I've been speaking in front of an audience without notes, when I genuinely have forgotten what comes next, I take a pause, which for me feels like an eternity, and for the audience feels like a sort of, pregnant, dramatic pause. And then if I can't think what comes next, I just say this point again. Plant flags. And it serves as repetition. Repetition, by the way, is another really useful way of getting information into other people's minds, where we're all actually going to remember it. Redundancy is your enemy in speaking and writing. Repetition is your friend. Think back to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. He said, I have a dream. So many times. I forget, it was like 15 times. It was like more than 10 times. He also said, let freedom ring, multiple times in the course of that speech. Repetition is a way that we can be also planting those flags in people's minds. And so if I stand up there and I think, I couldn't remember what comes next, I've said the point again, and usually the next thing comes. If it doesn't, I just move on to the next point. And nobody is any the wiser, except that now I've told you, you'll know that when that happens later on this afternoon, you'll know, oh gosh, she just forgot what she was going to say next. So number 1, take risks. Number 2, plant flags. Number 3, and here's where we get closer to the scriptures, so Jen will be proud of me, make metaphors. What is the most memorable psalm? Thank you, somebody, Psalm 23. I know that was the answer that all of you really had. Not the one that you have sat down to memorize, but the one that most people will think, oh yeah, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. That psalm starts with a metaphor. The Lord is the shepherd, David, and we as God's people as his sheep. And David works through the psalm sprinkling that metaphor along the way. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. His rod and his staff, they comfort me. We see that initial metaphor unpacked in various different ways throughout David's short psalm. And that is something that's sort of known in the speaking trade as a central explanatory metaphor. It's a metaphor that you introduce early on in the talk. You come back to it multiple times in the talk, and maybe even end with it, not necessarily. But it's something that gives people a kind of central sense of where you're going and what you're saying. And metaphors are a really powerful way for us to invite the audience to connect with what we're saying, both intellectually and emotionally. Jesus used metaphors more than almost anybody else, if you think about it. Often with his famous I am sayings, I'm the good shepherd, I'm the light of the world. I'm the true vine. And when we make metaphors, we invite the audience to remember what we're saying and often actually to be moved by what we're saying. And here's the good news with metaphors. A bad metaphor is better than no metaphor at all. Now let me qualify that slightly. When I say a bad, not one that is actively misleading, but whereas there is a Platonic ideal of the metaphor that is very kind of emotionally evocative and powerful and, absolutely unforgettable in every possible way, most of us, when we're sitting down to write a talk or even to lead a Bible study and we're sort of trying to think of a good metaphor to illustrate what we're saying, we may not instantly have those Shakespeare moments. We may just come up with a kind of mediocre metaphor, and that's okay. I've sometimes, when I've talked about how to give a talk, used the example of going to the grocery store and getting all this delicious food and then not having any bags to take it home in. And if you prepare a talk that is filled with biblical riches, but you don't have any metaphors or stories or sort of memorable ways for your audience to pick it up and take it home with them, they're just having to leave all that delicious produce at the store. So we want to make metaphors, even if they are as unromantic as a plastic shopping bag, which, by the way, is the metaphor I just used, kind of a lame metaphor. But I'm guessing that you'll remember it because it's sort of weird and lame. So let's see if we can get the points. You can help me with this. Number 1, take risks. Number 2, number 3, number 4, tell stories. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because it's something that's obvious in Jesus' ministry. Now, I was chatting earlier with some folks over lunch, and we were reflecting on the fact that some false teachers in our society today do a really good job of telling stories. Some heresies and really unhelpful ways of thinking have been packaged in great stories, and whether it's the story of somebody's life or just they're wonderful storytellers. And so it can make those of us who are deeply invested in God's word feel kind of reticent to use stories. But actually, let's not do that. Because who told the most wonderful stories? Jesus, right? So we should absolutely be telling stories. I'll leave that there. The last one, I hope. Did we get to, was that 4? Excellent, fantastic. So the last one, number 5, is create contrasts. I don't like roller coasters at all, but I do love my 11-year-old daughter. And this last summer we were at an amusement park that had this big roller coaster, and she needed somebody to go with her, and I said that I would. And the thing with roller coasters is they are generally really fast, right? The velocity on average is very quick. But it's not just helter-skelter all the time. You have that sort of slow up to the top, and then you have that terrifying moment at the top where you're like, shivering and shaking, and then it's down and up and round and all about, yeah? When you're giving a talk, there's an extent to which you want to be taking people on a roller coaster ride, because remember this, you've got to keep them with you. And if you create the contrast between when you're speaking quickly and when you're speaking slowly and when you stop, maybe because you've forgotten what you're going to say, maybe not, they just don't know. It will give them that roller coaster experience. It will create the contrast. You can also create contrast in the ways that you form sentences. Famously, when Neil Armstrong first walked on the moon, he said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Creating a sentence or pair of sentences that had a contrast of ideas between the first and the second. We can sculpt individual sentences that give us that sense of contrast and really burrow into people's minds. So we need to create contrast both in how fast we speak, how loud we're speaking, how quietly we're speaking and drawing them in, and the rate at which we're speaking. All of these can give them the roller coaster experience that keeps them with us. And lastly, it's really helpful if you're giving a talk to return to your opening at the end. It gives people a sort of sense of completion. So I'm going to finish off. Oh, wait a minute. This is embarrassing. Okay. I was going to finish off the first story by telling you about my friend waking in the night to pray for me. And I chose to do that rather than to tell you the really embarrassing thing that was also true that day. But because I squandered that conclusion, I'm going to have to tell you the embarrassing one. As I mentioned, I'd recently had my 3rd child. And those of you who have multiple children may know that sometime after having multiple children, running is not to be advised if you want to keep your trousers extremely dry. So I literally had to make the decision in that moment as I was running out of the hotel room. Do I walk and arrive 15 minutes late, or do I run and arrive 5 to 10 minutes late, but with the risk of the things having happened? And so my last piece of advice is wear black or at least dark blue trousers so that when everything goes horribly wrong, you're at least not completely humiliating yourself. Thank you.
So I want to start with a fun question. When y'all were children, what did you want to be when you grew up? And don't say Bible teacher, because...
Important.
Loved.
I wanted to be an eye doctor. Sorry.
I wanted to be a pediatrician, to be clear.
An eye doctor, because he changed my life. I thought the trees were just blobs. And when I went, and he gave me glasses, and I was like, oh, wow. So I wanted to do that for other people.
A horse trainer.
I also went through a major horse girl phase. Where are my horse girls at? Okay. Yeah, I did want that too.
Okay. I didn't have that phase.
She's not judging you.
I didn't feel that at all, yeah.
It's not too late. That's what Courtney told me. It's not too late. Thank you. I wanted to be a businesswoman. I dressed up as a businesswoman for,
That's
briefcase and all.
That's the
My
kind
daddy's
of
briefcase.
important I wanted to be, yeah.
All right. Serious question. How did you come into the space of teaching the Bible? Did you go to seminary? Did you just come up in the local church? Kind of what is everyone's journey to the place that you are now?
I was late 20s, early 30s. I had known the Lord for less than 10 years, and a pastor in the church where we were invited me to co-teach a class with him. And he said we were going to teach through a book, and he would help me learn how to do it. And he did, and he continued to invite me into places to teach and encouraged me to do it. And I think that initial encouragement was huge in training and equipping, but giving me the opportunity. And then that kind of repeated itself in my 40s. My husband and I went to seminary together, and which is why I always say we, so I have to explain it because it sounds so funny. We went to seminary. I'm not using like the royal we. Two of us together went to seminary, and it was, again, some professors that were just very encouraging of that and created space for me to do that in that setting. And so it was people creating space and inviting in.
As I said earlier, I became a Christian at 14, and at 16, you know how Young Life has those campaigner groups? I don't know if any of you, they're like the small group Bible study of Young Life. They decided to limit who could go to it, so only like 8 special high schoolers could go to it. I was not one of those 8. So we decided at 16, we can do this. And so we just had our own, we called it campaigners, but it wasn't with Young Life. It was just what we knew to call Bible study. And so we started our own, and I had no training and really not, and the Lord just kept putting me in places where I ended up saying, why not? And we just do it. And thankfully, along the way, he has provided great training. But I haven't been to seminary. I call myself theologically homeschooled. And so I have a great partner, my husband, who we have a lot of great conversations. And I just really believe you can learn a lot just by reading the Bible every day.
I was studying a PhD in Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare. And I was chatting with a friend who was my scariest non-Christian friend. So like my other non-Christian friends, I'd invite them to a thing at church and they would politely excuse themselves. This friend would tell me why she was ideologically opposed to everything my church stood for. And she and I were chatting about what we might do next. And she has gone on to be a professor in her discipline. She's fantastic. And I said to her, I'm not half smart enough to make it as an English professor unless I sacrifice like everything for that, and probably not even then, but like if I would have to sacrifice everything for that, and I'm not passionate enough about studying the English literature to sacrifice everything for that. And she said, well, what would you sacrifice everything for? And I said, well, telling people about Jesus. And then I thought, you know what, maybe I should go to seminary. So I emailed the lady who was the women's minister at our church, and I said, I've been thinking I might go to seminary. And I was saying it kind of as a joke, like not exactly a joke, but I did it. Like the reason I'm doing this is because I was pretty sure she was going to say, I think you may not have noticed that you're not a boy, and so you're definitely not going to seminary. And she replied and she said, I think it's a great idea. I've already talked to Mark, our senior pastor. We're like putting you forward. And I was like, I was sort of joking. But then I thought the Church of England spends its money on a lot of really stupid things. They might as well spend it on giving me a theological education. So It's just true. It's just...
Am I your scariest Christian friend, or?
No, but
No.
you're auditioning for the
Keep
role.
trying.
Yeah.
Keep trying. It's great. I have an English degree, and I come from a family of teachers, and I thought, well, I'm not doing what they did because I want to be important. Wouldn't you have loved to have known 21-year-old Jen? I was a delight. So I got an MBA and worked for Foley's department stores, 55 retail outlets, and I was in the buying office for men's dress shirts. And then I had my first child, and I quit my glamorous retail job. It was not. And was invited to my first women's Bible study at the church, and I needed a reason to put on clothes and go somewhere. So I went, and they had childcare. And don't get me started on the importance of childcare when you're doing Bible study, but I seriously would not be a Bible teacher if the church had not watched my child. So if your church can do it, I highly recommend it. And I was in a small group, and I was talking too much. My apology to all of the small group leaders in the room. And Jackie Jackson ducked her head into my room and said, "Can you come out here for a second?" And I thought, I'm about to be sent home from Bible study. And she said, "Have you ever thought maybe you have a teaching gift?" And I was like, I don't know. And then she asked me to fill in her women's Bible study, her women's Sunday school class. And then she ended up leaving the church, and she said, "Could you just do this until they find the replacement for me?" And I was like, yeah, I mean, I guess so. And I taught the class for 8 years. And so I had to show up every week with something to say. And it was just really formative for me. And so I sort of discovered who I was in that room. And then Jeff always likes to point out that I didn't want to teach because it wasn't lucrative, and then I taught for free for 20 years. So in honor of you, hun. And then with just learning, like trying to get educated, I knew how to, I was a reader, from studying literature. I knew how to read books, so I was not intimidated to pick up theology books or anything like that. Doesn't mean I necessarily was doing a great job absorbing it all. But for my 30th birthday, Jeff, the diehard romantic, gave me Louis Berkhof's Systematic Theology, and that kept me out of most ditches. So.
I was working in business. I am an accountant by trade, so if you love numbers and Excel spreadsheets, you're my kind of people. And I was volunteering for my local church, and they needed somebody to teach Sunday school, and they asked me if I would teach Sunday school, and I just fell in love with it. I've always loved helping people understand things, whether that's how to budget their money or how to read the Word. And we did inductive Bible study, and I was like, man, I want to know more. And so 2010, quit my job, sold my stuff, and went to seminary, and took a risk on the Lord, which is never really a risk. And he kept opening up doors for me to serve and for me to come on staff in my local church. And a lot of times what I'll tell people is it was the opportunity that nobody else wanted. And the Lord used me and grew me in those rooms to be able to learn how to teach His Word. Rebecca, I'm going to give this question to you since you just told us all your wonderful little tricks of the trade of speaking, because it is a craft, right? And there are some really practical things that we have to do to form our messages and to be able to prepare to teach the Bible. And so when you think about practically, outside of the 5 points that you gave us, what does it look like for you to be ready to do what you just did in front of us in terms of preparing to speak or teach the Bible?
Honestly, it really depends. So sometimes, it's just because of the nature of my particular ministry, it's relatively rare that I'm asked to teach a specific passage of the Bible, like as a Bible passage. And it's delightful when I love when I get to do that. And when I get to do that, it's completely, like everything has to be tailor-made to that particular talk because it's all for that particular passage. most of the time when I'm speaking, it's a little bit like when you make a meal out of leftovers, and you're like, oh, I'll take the, the leftover veg from there and the meat from there, and I'll put some soy sauce on and some, boil some rice, and here we go. So it's not that every element is prepared for that specific space, but it's kind of taking things from different places, reorganizing them, adding some fresh things so that they fit. And the longer you go on doing that, the more leftovers you have. It's like such an unromantic metaphor, and I'm sorry. But also, if you only find yourself recycling stuff, I think it gets very tired and boring, and ultimately, you're not really loving your audience well if you're not putting particular attention into working to serve them. So, yeah, I try to just kind of continue to learn and bring that into what I'm saying as I go along.
Yeah. I think the best teachers are those who are listening to other great teachers teach. So we're always refining our craft. How about you, Courtney?
I think that, well, and Rebecca and I have gone back and forth on this through the years. So I am a manuscript girl. So here's where Rebecca and I agree. We agree with connection and risk. So the goal is to connect with
and Jesus.
The people. We do agree on Jesus. Agree on Jesus. So I am much more methodical about it, and I do predominantly just teach a passage. That is, I don't do a lot of teaching outside of that. So I print it off, and I read it and read it and read it and read it and mark it and circle and make connections and start asking questions and thinking through it. And then I look at the structure of the text, because the structure of the message should match the structure of the text, and I put it out in that structure, and I start thinking about it. And a lot of times I will actually write down, not that I actually go back and do all of these, but I will write down explanation, illustration, application under each part of the structure. Because for me, it reminds me, I do not intuitively illustrate. I explain and I apply. And so if I want to have good metaphors and good stories and all of those things, I have to put them in my outline. And then I start filling it in, and I start thinking about it and kind of playing with it and trying to come up with the ways that you can phrase it in a memorable way, memorable for me, and then hopefully memorable for anybody that I'm teaching. And a lot of times I'll come up with this really finely fun, great, memorable way, and I look back and I'm like, that's not actually in the text. And so you got to let that go and start over with that. But yeah, so it's just a lot of, but for me, it's much more methodical. And then I end up with the manuscript.
Yeah. Courtney or Jen, are there any other, I think every speaker, sorry, Courtney, Melissa, I'm sorry, don't do this. Are there any I think every speaker has those unique things you do in your process. And so you both are seasoned teachers. Are there just unique things that you've learned to do over the years that work for your personality, teaching style that you do every time to prepare?
Well, I mean, I'm with what's her name? Sorry. With Courtney, with the repetitive reading, I really think that the most underutilized skill in both Bible reading and in teaching the Bible is repetitive reading. I will say it till my dying day, because you just have to give it time to start soaking in. And so I teach, sorry guys, from an annotated copy. What happened? I teach from an annotated copy of the text, and so the work that I ask the student to do is the work that I've done to prepare the message. And then one of the things that I do to keep that copy I'm teaching from as clean as possible, because I'm a very visual learner, and so once I actually get it annotated, I can't throw it away and start over. It has to be the one. I can use whiteout, but I can't. So if you're wondering who's still buying whiteout in 2023, it's me. And then if I need a cross-reference, if I'm going to go to a passage that is going to help with the passage that I'm in, I keep all of those pulled onto a separate page that has a little flag at the top, and they're numbered so that I can find when I need to bounce over to them when I'm teaching. That way I have less content right in front of me when I teach. Is that the kind of thing you were looking for?
That's great. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
But I do not manuscript, and I have a lot of opinions. I actually think most of my opinions about it are based on, I think it's your personality. Everybody has to do what works for them. That's the truth.
I'm with Jen on repetitive reading, and I even mean that for the whole biblical text. Read it, read it, read it, read it. And here's why. I mean, and I read it separate from my actual preparation to teach it. And I think that really matters. Just over the years, just keep reading the text, keep reading the text, because all of a sudden you're going to be walking in your garden and you're going to see something happen and you're like, oh, that's the best way to explain that. You know, I'm sitting there doing dishes and my plum tree is staring at me and I'm watching things happen and I'm like, huh, it just bears fruit and it doesn't get to eat the fruit. It never benefits from the fruit, but it's a plum tree and it just bears it and I get to enjoy it. Now I'm having a whole conversation in my head about what's the Lord doing in me when I abide in him and he's bearing fruit. And I'm learning. You know, so everything becomes my classroom when I'm in the Word every day. And when the whole world is my classroom, I'm going to have illustrations to share when I'm teaching a text. And so being in the text every day is going to influence the way I see everything that God's doing in the world. And it all starts to matter. It all starts to be things we can pull from that we can say, this is the way I can help explain that better. So I would say actually being curious and confused about the text are going to, you being personally curious. I'm constantly like, what is that about? Who are those giants? What are they called? Amalek? What are, in the, yeah, all that. See, I have
the word slalom.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Did you mean the Nephilim? Because I'd love for us to talk about that a little bit.
All of them.
You could just
That's what I
preach
said
on
with
it a
my
little.
English
Just
accent.
Preach.
I mean, I've written in my Bible for years, what are those? One day I'm going to research it. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. And so just being continually curious about the text is going to help you as you teach. But then I'm a big believer in outlines. It's the flags. Like, what am I going to hang this message on? How do I make sense of it? And so I manuscript, but I actually rarely read my manuscript when I'm teaching because I have my flags. And so it's there just in case, because I'm not as okay with getting lost. Just in case I have my lifeboat ready to go.
So here's the thing, I manuscript too. I fully wrote out the talk just for now, and I fully wrote out the talk for this afternoon, but I'm not going to have them with me. And so something a little bit different will happen. But I'm also a manuscripter.
Rebecca has been known to text me as I'm getting on an airplane to go speak. What are you risking? What are you risking?
It's the worst. Also, I wish I'd known what she was going to say before I taught you earlier.
The talk was so great.
All right.
I'm still trying to become friends with her, you see.
I'm ending this with this one, and Courtney, I'm going to ask you to give us some wisdom, a short piece of wisdom, because understanding why we need to hone our skills and prepare to teach the Bible makes sense if you think you're going to do those things and if you're teaching to large groups. But what about the woman who says, I don't want to teach, or I won't ever teach a large group? What encouragement would you have for her?
We are all teaching the Word. We are all teaching the Word. You might be teaching it to another woman sitting at your kitchen table. You might be teaching it to a 3-year-old. You might be explaining it to your neighbor. But we all need to rightly handle the word of truth. And so understanding, Melissa and I have taught a cohort for a couple of years, and even the first time we did it, and she was talking about how even to facilitate a small group discussion, she goes through the exact preparation that I go through to prepare a message because she wants to be ready to rightly handle the word of truth. And that was really convicting to me. And so this place right here is really a very rare place to teach the word. I mean, this is not even where I predominantly teach the word. I'm in discipleship relationships, and I have grandchildren and children, and we're speaking the word of truth to each other, and I want to rightly handle it. And as I preach the word to myself, and I remind myself of the gospel, I want to rightly handle it. So I think we're all teaching and preaching the word in various spaces.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, ladies. Can we show them love for their wisdom? Thank you.
Here, up, am I on? There we go. Stay up here because we do have a little time, just a little time for Q&A. So if you have your question, we're about to trade mics so they work. So I need to trade this mic with you.
Oh, Gus is hanging in there.
How is Gus was the question, and Gus is...
He's doing okay.
If you have a question, what I need you to do is stand up and come to the front. Elizabeth's going to have the mic, and you can ask your question to her.
I'll let you ask the women directly, but I'll hold the microphone.
Oh, genius. Okay, so my question is, I started with helping build a church from the ground up, so it's very, very tiny. And I'm volunteering for the women, so I write Bible studies, teach Bible studies, and do messages. And although that was wonderful and good for me because I loved it, I'm catching an issue of I'm growing, but the women are growing slower, and I'm gaining more like baby believers. And so would there be wisdom in me as a leader stepping back from creating and using even like Lifeway things so that I can more intentionally disciple one-on-one with women to grow, because I'm struggling doing it by myself, so it would be wiser to step back in creating and growing women up to then be able to help me with everything else.
We would encourage using Lifeway products.
Can I ask a follow-up question? About how many women?
We have about 50 women that are there.
So,
and I have a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old, so don't put too much on me, okay?
Okay.
Just start there.
Okay, so I would say that if you have 50 women, then you have roughly 5 small groups that need to be happening, and that would help. But also, the absolute hardest thing to do is write curriculum. Can I get a witness? And so if you are not in a state, that is why I'm willing to put my stuff out, because I know how hard it is. And if you're not ready to, I started using someone else's curriculum, I would imagine we all did. And then as I began to develop a sense of how I wanted to teach, then it made more sense for me to write my own. But the fact that other people can use it, I really want it to be available for people who just aren't ready yet to take that on themselves, or who maybe never will, so that you do have the freedom to do that, to major in the things that you do have time and energy to major in. But I would say if it's 50 women, whatever gathering you're having needs to have a small group component to it, so that they are getting care, not necessarily from you, but from a small group leader. Did you guys?
Okay, so my question is a little different. I think part of like leading women is also equipping them to use their gifts and to cultivate that. So beyond just like us who have maybe like the gift of leading and teaching, I've kind of a 2-part question. One, what would you recommend as far as like a spiritual gift inventory or like assessment, preferably free if you know of one, that we can use to help equip our women? And then 2 would be, how do you use, like Melissa, you had mentioned this when you were talking about like you had vision and like wanting to use that across and use it somewhere within the church or to help with the body of Christ. What do you do with the gift of encouragement? What do you do with the gift of discernment in the church? And how do you help those women grow in those giftings as a leader?
I say as you recognize gifts in women, create space for them to use them. So if you recognize the gift of discernment in somebody, invite her into conversations where the discernment is needed. If you recognize gifts of teaching, give her an opportunity to teach, but with the foreknowledge that there will be a feedback loop and you're going to speak back into that. And so you are giving opportunity with feedback for growth to test out gifts and to see if they're actually playing out like that. I mean, we all need that, and we need the confirmation and affirmation from the body as our gifts sort of become a little bit more known, to know, yeah, that's actually a place I can serve and it bears fruit by God's grace.
And one thing on that, where people are most frustrated I often think is the place maybe they're supposed to serve. So they, if you're sitting, if they're like, that teaching was not good, I'm like, well, you're probably supposed to do it then. Or, if they don't like how something's being done or planned, often I'm like, well, rather than take it as a critique, it's an opportunity. Hey, well, tell me how we could do that better. And often that's exactly the part of the body they're gifted for. So sometimes I'll look for the frustrated places and say, well, let's do this. Let's come along and help.
And we do have a spiritual gifts assessment for free on lifeway.com. I think if you just type Lifeways and spiritual gifts into Google, you'll find it.
Okay, cool.
Hey, this is specific for Jen. You mentioned the 6 years at the Village Church that were so hard, and the hard 6 years. What led you to stay at that church for those 6 years?
I'm terribly codependent. No, I don't know. You can decide when you hear my answer. No, at the time that was all happening, my kids were plugged in, my husband plugged in, serving, and so 5 out of 6 Wilkins were thriving at the Village. And if you've ever had kids who are right in that middle school, early high school phase, and they're doing well, you don't go looking around for another place. And I think it was the Lord's kindness to me, because I probably would have wanted to bolt. And so I really see it as like he tethered me there because of those things. And so it sounds like super noble to people, I think, sometimes, that I didn't leave, but there were very practical family considerations that I think the Lord had to keep me in that space for those years. Yeah.
Hello. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how you practice humility in leadership, like personally. Like, do you have any suggestions for someone who might deal with prideful thoughts in a leadership capacity, asking for a friend?
Well, we're going to answer for a friend. No.
What I would say, one thing that has helped me kind of pull down those pride moments is having people around me who will remind me that I'm not as great as I think I am. And really, people that can have those spaces of accountability. And so whether it's a thought or my reflections on an event or the ways I'm being critical, so I'm still centering myself, that person can bring me back to a place of humility, but also just, for me, biblical self-examination. So asking the Lord continually, where am I off? Where am I centering myself more than I ought to? When we ask the Lord to humble us, he frequently shows up immediately. So it's those two things, spiritual formation habits, but also community has been helpful.
And can I say also, pride can come in 2 ways. Mm-hmm. Pride can come in thinking you should always be the one on the stage, but it can also come in thinking, because I'm not, I was going to use you, sorry. Because I'm not Jen Wilkin and I don't teach like her, I'm not going to do it. I struggle with this. So pride can come in different ways. Like, I don't write like that person, so what good is my book? Like, I don't ask questions like that so for me, it has been the willingness to actually get on the stage at times. So just check your pride both ways, and have the humility to maybe be the 3rd best teacher in your church. But you're going to do it.
Yeah.
I would just very briefly add, the Lord may just humble you repeatedly in ways you didn't want, which is what happens most frequently to me. Just briefly.
Thanks for being that little ray of sunshine.
It's something that happens with regularity, often connected with, if I'm about to give a big talk or something, I will, something, not the dog thing, but something that hits me in a way which reminds me that I am absolutely not all that. So you may not even have that problem because the Lord may be doing that.
Thank you.
Hi, this question's for Rebecca, or everybody, I guess. I just sort of like to ask, how do you incorporate apologetics when you're teaching women? I think it's so core, especially as we're forming Gen Z and Alpha, and I've so appreciated your recent book. And so I just wanted to know, how would you ease in apologetics when you're teaching lay people?
Mm-hmm. I think the reality is, almost every Christian right now is facing apologetics questions, whether they realize it or not, whether they would use that term or not. But whether you are a grandmother thinking, how do I relate to my 13-year-old granddaughter who's just told me she's non-binary, or whether you are a 13-year-old going into a public middle school and needing to figure out how to stand as a Christian in the midst of all sorts of things, you're facing apologetics questions. So I think the reality is what the apologetics needs have changed in the last 20 years, even in the last 10 years, even in the last 5 years, actually. But if we are watching for the things that are stopping people from considering Christianity, the roadblocks that mean they're not even, Jesus isn't even in the field of consideration for them, because of course, how could you be a Christian in light of all the abuse scandals? Or how could you be a Christian with all the racism that we've seen in the church? Or how could you be a Christian with all the hateful ways in which Christians have treated LGBT people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Those are going to be the places where actually people are really struggling. And they're often places where, those who've been raised in the church or have been to church for years, they go to church and it's like, nobody realizes this is happening, or all they're hearing from the pulpit is those crazy people out there doing those bad things, and everybody's sitting in the pews thinking, okay, but this is my granddaughter, or this is my dear friend from college, or this is whoever it is. Those are the spaces where we need to be identifying the apologetics needs and then opening our Bibles and seeing what does the Bible say and how does it relate here? Because it is extraordinary quite how contemporary and relevant the scriptures are in the year of our Lord 2023 as we face all of these things.
I would add to that, just really quickly, one way that I do that to kind of ease it in is I'll use it through my illustrations and my stories. So if I'm trying to make some theological point, then I will create a bridge to culture to talk about that issue and then giving people a way to explain. So I think that's kind of like a simpler way, and then being able to invite people into spaces where they need the deep dive.